Welcome back, everybody. There's one stock that's one of the most talked about in the market, yet one of the most misunderstood, and that stock is Palantir. And similar to how I started with Nvidia, I've kind of ignored Palantir for a while, even at one point muting them on X because their run-up was so crazy and I didn't really understand their business. But over the last year, Palantir is up over 5.5x, yes, over 450% in just the last 12 months. Just a remarkable run. So just like I did with Nvidia, I decided I'm going to stop being a hater. I'm going to swallow my pride a little bit and dig into this business to understand what it's all about. So let's take a look at Palantir. Now, this analysis is as of June 5th, when the price was at $119.91. And the first question when it comes to Palantir is always, well, what does Palantir actually do? And trust me when I say this is what we're going to dig into a lot in this video, because that's where I spent most of my time. So if you just take a look at the high-level slide, you see that it says Palantir Technologies is a data analytics and decision intelligence company that builds platforms to integrate, visualize, and interpret large and complex data sets. So don't worry, because we're going to dig into these things in a lot more detail. Now, in terms of who their customer is, it's governments, commercial enterprises, which is basically other businesses, and the health and public sector. Now, there's other sectors as well. I just highlighted those because those are, I think, the ones people mostly talk about. In terms of their total addressable market, now again, these are kind of estimates, but you have government and defense at about 30 billion, enterprise AI decision platforms at about 60 billion, and then AIP, which we're going to talk about in more detail, at about 20 billion. And there's some overlap here with this and the other two, but in general, the estimate for their TAM is a little over $100 billion. Now, before some of you guys get all bent out of shape, these are extremely conservative estimates, and they're actually more in line with what Palantir themselves kind of said when they IPO'd in 2020, and then I think they updated it again in 2023. But more current estimates in some cases are way higher than this. I think Morningstar just said that their TAM may be up to 1.2 trillion or 1.4 trillion. Now, all that may be true. That'd be like a 10x from what this is saying. But at this point, I just decided to put the most conservative estimate in here. And then obviously you can apply whatever you think the TAM is in your own research. Now, in terms of how I think Palantir is different, integrated ontology, which is something we're going to talk about a lot, mission critical operational AI, and bespoke solutions. And if those things don't really mean anything to you yet, don't worry, because we're going to get into it. So if we just take a look at the growth of the business, you can see revenue year over year is 33.5%. And this is on a trailing 12 month to the previous trailing 12 month basis. The 5-year average revenue compound annual growth rate is 29.2. So it's accelerating. That's good. Earnings per share, 92.5. That's really good. This is blank because probably that initial year they had negative earnings or weren't profitable yet. And then free cash flow per share up 93.6%, which is excellent, and accelerating from the 5-year average. And you can see it here on the graph, right? This is what you want to see. The revenue is up and to the right. The operating income, which was negative, is now positive and just has a nice little trend to it. And then operating cash flow as well. There's some variability there, but in general, everything is up and to the right. So now that we know that the business is growing, let's talk about how Palantir actually makes money. Now, Palantir is a software company, so obviously they make money from software contracts, but they're a little bit different than some of the other companies out there because a lot of what they do is on a more customized basis, so their contracts will tend to be a little bit more involved, a little bit more customized in nature. So while you might have other SaaS companies that have more traditional subscription packages or like a limited number of add-ons, Palantir tends to have more bespoke solutions and contracts that go along with them. So if we take a look at their business segment slides, you can see that their business segments are basically broken down into government and commercial, which we kind of touched on the previous slide there. And you can see the revenue from last quarter is a little bit under $500 million for government and a little under $400 million for commercial. And the growth rates there are, strong on both. They're both over 30%, with government being over 45%. And if you're wondering why these two add up to higher than the 33.5 we saw here, that's because these are trailing 12 months to the previous trailing 12 month, and these are based on the most recent quarter compared to the previous year. So if we take a look at their geographic breakdown, you can see the bulk of their revenue comes from the US, and it's also their highest growing segment at over 50%. And then growth in the UK is also significant at over 40%, and the rest of the world growth here is just kind of stayed flat. So at first glance, there's an obvious story here. You have revenue, earnings, and cash flow that are growing and accelerating. You have both the government and commercial revenue segments that are growing above 30% and accelerating, and you have the US and UK growth that's really driving all that. So just looking at the basic numbers, it's clear that this is a company that's getting more profitable over time while still accelerating their top line growth with products and services that seem to be gaining more traction. But the big question for Palantir is the same one that I had for years before I kind of dug into their business. It's, what does Palantir actually do? And in my experience, whenever I've asked this question before, the type of answers that I usually got went something like this. Well, they do data and analytics and AI, but for governments. They have ontology, which is disrupting software, and their Gotham and Foundry products are best in class. And while those sentences may be true, they don't actually tell you anything about what Palantir actually does. And so that's what I've been spending my time on, trying to understand more about what their actual business is and how they're different. And if we go back, it's the same things that we saw here on this business overview slide: integrated ontology, mission critical operational AI, and bespoke solutions. But those are just words that you might be like, well, what does that actually mean? Don't worry, because in this video, we're going to break it all down in detail. And I just want to caveat this to say that if any of you out there are actually Palantir experts and you really understand this business, if I say something that happens to be technically incorrect, feel free to correct me in the comments. I'm just doing this based on how I think I understand their business, so I could definitely be wrong in some places. The first thing that's helpful to understand Palantir is that, number one, stop thinking that they're just a data and analytics company, because to me that doesn't come close to describing kind of what they do and what makes them special. Because if we go back to this first slide, I think this phrase is a little bit better. They're a data analytics and decision intelligence company. And let me give you an example of what I mean. And this example is actually from my real life experience in my corporate career, and it really helped me understand Palantir's business better. Now, if you don't know my background, I basically worked in payments tech and payments operations for pretty much my whole career. I started as an IT programmer on enterprise payment systems. I then moved over to the business side, kind of in infrastructure and operations. I even did payments product management. So I've kind of been all around the circle of payments and how to process payments, both on a business and technology side for, over a decade or so. And while payments may not be as mission critical as, say, a top secret government use case, they're pretty close. I mean, we had 100% SLA, meaning that every single payment that came in, we had to process. We couldn't just drop one on the floor. So let me give you a situation that actually happened in my career that I think helps explain Palantir a little bit better. Now, we had payment batch jobs that ran daily and processed billions of dollars each day. We had a couple instances where we found out after the fact that our accounts were out of balance, and we do the research, spend IT and business resources to investigate, and then figure out that we had like a missing file somewhere, or maybe we had some transactions for the day that didn't actually get put into the file or something similar. And trust me when I say this type of thing is very painful, because real people are impacted. Maybe their payment didn't get hit on time. And now all of a sudden we're talking about remediation and trying to make sure it's good. So one of the data teams came to us with a solution, and they said, look, we ran the numbers from the analytics data store. We can see that the output from job A doesn't really match with what was expected from database B. And we can show you all the times that it's happened. And basically we get this data every single night. So in the morning, you can find out which jobs didn't produce the information you expected from the previous day. I mean, this sounds amazing, right? Well, no, it's not amazing. It actually sucks, because all this stuff is after the fact where we've already screwed up. So all you're telling us is the stuff that we already messed up that now we have to go back and fix. And yes, we get it a little bit earlier. And yes, we get a little bit more information to help us investigate, but we still screwed it up to begin with. What we need is something that actually helps us make the process right as it's going. So here's what we actually did instead. We created validation steps after each part of our workflow that would ensure everything was supposed to get processed actually got processed before moving on to the next step. We then created a dashboard that would show us where each job was at in the process, which ones had failed and which one had succeeded. And if anything actually failed, we were immediately notified with exactly the information we needed to correct the problem. So not only did it prevent us from screwing up in the first place, it drastically reduced the amount of time, effort, and cost it took to support billions of dollars of payments every single day. And what we called this at the time was run-to-run controls, with the idea being that we wanted the right automated software and decision-making capabilities injected into the operational process so that we could prevent issues from ever happening instead of trying to troubleshoot them after the fact. And so bringing this back to Palantir is like run-to-run controls, but on a much more advanced and sophisticated level. And how they do it is initially they work with you to understand your business process, your data objects, their attributes, the flow of data in your business, and then they create what they call an ontology, which is effectively a digital twin of your business. And that ontology allows them to integrate, visualize, and operationalize the data that's flowing from the many disparate systems that usually don't ever talk to each other, which every single corporation has. And once they've built that ontology, then they can start finding places to integrate software automation, decision-making, and AI to be able to drive value and efficiencies in your business. And that's really the key differentiator for Palantir. Like, there's a ton of companies out there that do data and analytics. There's a ton of companies that are integrating AI, and there's a ton of companies that will help you find, quote, insights. And Palantir's doing that, but integrated into your actual operational process, not just analytics or reports. And that idea of operational decision intelligence or operational AI is unique and has infinitely more value than your traditional data and analytics use cases. So if we go back to Palantir and look at these, how are they different items again, integrated ontology, I mean, this is a huge deal, and it's a huge moat for Palantir because it's extremely hard to do. That ontology is going to be different for every business. Like, yeah, there's some patterns there that you can reuse, but each business is unique. And that's why they send people ahead of time to really understand the business that they're going to be working with before they build any software. And if you've ever worked in a big corporation, you know how hard it is to sometimes just find people who know enough about the business and the process to be able to document it. And each time Palantir does this, they learn new things that they can integrate into future projects with future clients, whether that's simply in how to organize or design the ontology for a specific type of business, or in how to integrate certain operational components to add value in their process. So each iteration and each improvement adds to their moat. So ontology is a huge deal. Now, next is mission critical operational AI. And now I already touched on why the operational piece is so unique, but Palantir's also made themselves a provider of choice for government and defense contracts, which means they have experience working on top secret things and working on software that has the highest level of security and governance requirements imaginable. And that's just not something that you do and master overnight. So combined with the fact that they're doing operational decision intelligence and operational AI integration, you can see why they're not just a data and analytics company. It doesn't nearly capture what they do. The three products you'll hear people talk about as it relates to Palantir are Gotham, Foundry, and AIP, which stands for Artificial Intelligence Platform. And the easiest way to explain them, in my opinion, is like this. Now, for Gotham, it's a custom-made software operating system for highly mission-critical government use cases. So things with very sensitive operations, maximum security, on-premise, and highly specialized. And when I say software operating system, imagine like the run-to-run dashboard that I talked about earlier, but on a much larger scale that includes all the important parts of your mission or overall business. And the ontology that we talked about before is like the map that you give to your operating system so that it knows where everything is and how it's related to each other, so that it has the ability to show you the information you need as well as act on the information in an operational way. Now, Foundry is very similar in that it's also a software operating system, but it's meant more for commercial or public sector use cases. So maybe not as customized, maybe a little bit more template-based, and not quite as strict security requirements, but tailored to certain industries and use cases depending on what their business model is. And it also uses the ontology in the same way as a data map for the operating system. Now, AIP, or Artificial Intelligence Platform, is actually used in combination with Gotham and Foundry. It's an AI engine that integrates large language models into your operational software, which means it can process natural language queries and questions and then perform actions. So if we go back to my run-to-run control example, let's say we had a batch job that failed and we weren't going to be able to fix it in time. If we had something like AIP, it would allow a business user to simply type "notify all impacted customers" about the delay, and it would be able to determine which customers were impacted by the specific issue based on the specific transactions, route that information to a notification system, and then provide any meaningful information that needs to be sent. And I know that's just an example, but that would be pretty amazing. And if you've worked in a corporate environment and you've dealt with any of these type of issues before, you know how painful it normally is. Now, I'm sure I lost a lot of viewers during that segment because we're digging into some details of their business, but I've said it many times that, look, looking at the fundamental numbers and the numbers on a chart is all good, but to me, where the real alpha is actually understanding what makes these businesses different from each other, and so that's why I've spent so much time there. So that being said, now that we understand their business a little bit better, let's talk about competition. And honestly, the more I dug into Palantir, the more that I felt that there wasn't really a direct competitor that was doing what they do at the scale that they're doing it, at least right now. But let's go ahead and go through these. Now, the first one I have is C3 AI because I actually think they're the closest competitor to Palantir. They obviously compete in industrial AI and decision platforms. Now, in general, Palantir is more broadly adopted. Obviously, Palantir has ontology. C3 has a thing that they do that's kind of like that, but not quite the same. So they do a lot of similar things in Palantir, but just not at the scale or with kind of the government roots that Palantir has. Now, next up is Snowflake. As you guys know, I hold this. Now, they both kind of manage and analyze data, so the whole like data and analytics piece, but Snowflake really concentrates more on structured data warehousing and analytics, while Palantir, like we've talked about, is operational decision making. And even though I own Snowflake, I don't really view Snowflake and Palantir as direct competitors. Like when I think of Snowflake, what they're building is a data and analytics platform, right? So you bring all your data into it, they provide you some tools and kind of a playground where you can get some insights and play around with your data. Whereas with Palantir, it's really about integrating into your operational process. To me, those are two different use cases. Now, you could argue, is one more valuable than the other? I think both have a place and both are obviously going to do well over time. I don't view them as direct competitors, though. So whenever people bring up Snowflake versus Palantir, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. I think they're really attacking different things, and we'll just kind of see how it plays out. Now, Databricks, we've talked about them in relation to Snowflake, but in relation to Palantir, obviously, as it relates to machine learning, AI workloads, and all that, they obviously do compete. But I have here that Databricks is really more concentrated on developers and data scientists, where Palantir is really about operations and business users. And then lastly, I have Amazon, Microsoft, and Google, basically the cloud providers, because they offer end-to-end data platforms with their cloud integrations. Palantir obviously is platform agnostic, and they're really optimized for deployment on hybrid or air-gapped environments for defense. Now, examples of these are things like, you have a mission-critical thing. It can't be in the cloud, right? They need like on-premise type stuff. And so obviously Palantir is going to have a direct advantage there. And I don't really think that the hyperscalers really compete with Palantir, even on an operational data perspective. So again, these are all strong competitors in their own right, but I don't think that they actually compete apples to apples with what Palantir does. Now, if we go over to risks and opportunities, now in terms of top risk, one, I have government budget pressure now, in the US or just across the globe. Obviously, since they get a core chunk of their revenue from governments, if there is kind of a slowdown in government spending, then that may hit them directly. My thought on this in general is that even though it is a risk, I think if they're really providing that true value that only they can provide, then it's going to be one of those things where spending may get cut, but maybe not in what they're doing, right? So if it's one of those things where, look, if you're going to cut stuff, you're probably not going to cut the stuff that's giving you the most value. And as long as that's Palantir, then this probably should be okay. Now, I put here scaling for commercial demand. In my opinion, that's a big one because they do a lot of really customized solutions. That's where a lot of the value comes from, but it also means that it's a little bit harder to scale, right? Because it takes time to get into each of these companies and really understand their business. Now, over time, I'm sure that they'll get better at it, as they keep going, and each one that they do kind of builds on the previous knowledge. But I do think that scaling is a big deal because obviously their growth rate is going to depend on how well they can scale that commercial sector. And then last for top risks, I have pace of change, competition, and AI. This is kind of a blanket one for any company in this space, just because things are moving so fast. It's just impossible to predict who all the competition is going to be and, what's going to win out in the end. Now, in terms of top opportunities, like I mentioned before, commercial acceleration is big. If you can really get into these, companies that have profit incentives and you can drive immense value, then all of a sudden everybody's going to want to use your software. I mean, it's pretty basic. Obviously, they're the operational AI category leader. And, that's a huge deal because it's one thing to get insights or, use AI for stuff that's not mission critical. But if you can actually drive real value in your operational process, it's worth a lot more. And then lastly, they have that kind of mission critical government pedigree. Again, that's not something that you just acquire overnight. It's something that's built up over time. And the fact that they have it already is a big plus for them. So in terms of questions to think about for investors as it relates to their business, I would say how much Palantir's growth was impacted by proposed budget cuts in government and or any economic slowdown in the commercial sector. We already talked about this. Yes, it's a concern, but at the end of the day, if they're driving that much value and they're driving more value than people are paying, then there's always going to be a market for that. Then two, can Palantir effectively scale their contract-based bespoke integration model into a larger commercial client pool, which we already talked about? And then lastly, what are the realistic expectations for growth and margins as competition and pace of change in AI continue to accelerate? And this is true of pretty much any software company, just because AI is going to stress margins a bit. Now, in Palantir's case, again, they do very customized stuff, so margins may be a little bit less impacted than a more traditional SaaS company. But that's something that we'll just have to see. And you might notice that there's nothing here about valuation yet because this is really about the business questions, but we're going to get to valuation here in a minute. So I know we went pretty heavy on the business already, but if you actually wanted to see this in action, there was a really great demo by Citi Wealth Management in their last AIP Con that showed some of it in detail. So I'll put a link to that down in the description if you want to check it out. Okay, so let's talk about some business fundamentals, and let's start with capital allocation. Now, Palantir's ROIC is 39.8, which is exceptionally good. The shareholder yield is actually slightly negative, and we'll see here that's because their shares outstanding is actually up year over year. And they've done some buybacks, but obviously it hasn't outpaced how much they issued, which is why that's negative. Now, they do have close to $1 billion of buybacks authorized left, so that's good. And then from a debt perspective, they're extremely healthy. I mean, they have negative net debt. Meaning they have more cash and short-term investments on hand than they do actual debt. Their debt to equity is basically zero, and their net debt to EBITDA is negative. So from a capital allocation and financial health standpoint, Palantir is extremely strong. Now, if we just look at profitability, you can see gross profit margin 80%, which is excellent and better than the 5-year average, which is great. And that's pretty much the story across the board. Net profit margins at 18, and it was negative in terms of the 5-year average. And free cash flow margin is just under 30%, which again is better than the 5-year margin. So if we just match this story up with our original growth slide, what you end up having is a company that's accelerating revenue growth, accelerating their income and cash flow growth. They're accelerating their profitability, and they have an extremely strong ROIC with no net debt. So no matter what you think about this company, that's a very strong story. But I know what everyone wants to talk about when it comes to Palantir, and that's valuation. So if we go to the valuation slide, now obviously if you look at this is going to be pretty ugly. So their trailing 12-month price to cash flow is 229 and their projected is 205. And so when you compare that to their growth rates, both trailing 12-month and projected, you can see that even those PCFG ratios are not very attractive. Now, if you want to look at earnings as well, their trailing 12-month PE is at a whopping 521, and even their projected PE is at 355. So their PEG ratios are, again, kind of out of this world. So the bottom line for Palantir is that, yeah, the valuation's crazy. If you thought that my Cloudflare and Snowflake valuations were crazy, well, this is obviously way worse. But at least in Palantir's case, they are GAAP profitable, and you know that their profitability is improving. But still, Palantir trades for an extreme premium right now. All right, so let's rate Palantir using the 3 criteria I use to evaluate stocks: business, operations, and valuation. Now, from a business perspective, obviously their ontology and operational AI are unique and highly valuable. Their experience with mission-critical use cases really sets them apart. And while commercial opportunities are going to be large, the question will be, can they actually scale their highly intensive and customized process to reach their potential there? But regardless, obviously from a business perspective, I would rate them as good. Now, in terms of operations, they have a extremely strong ROIC, they have zero net debt, so financially they're very healthy, and they have good margins that are already good, and they're improving from their 5-year averages. So even with some slight growth in shares outstanding, from an operations perspective, I would still rate them as good. And then lastly, in terms of valuation, there's not really anything to say here. Price to cash flow over 200, PE over 500. Even with really good growth outlooks, their PEG ratio and PCFG ratios are pretty poor. So from a valuation standpoint, I don't think there's anything to really rate them other than poor. And if we just do a quick wrap up, you can see, what's the story for Palantir? Category leader in mission-critical AI and decision software, highly customized contract-based implementations, integrated ontology for operational workflows is a key differentiator, and they're founder-led with a strong purpose-filled culture. And we haven't really touched on this in this video yet, but that was one of the more interesting things in my research when I was digging into the company. I'm actually listening to Dr. Karp's audiobook that I think he released late last year, and it's been pretty good. I've been enjoying it, and it really helps me understand kind of what drives them and the mission of the company. Now, we've talked about this already multiple times, but scalability to the commercial market is critical for their sustained growth. They're strong in accelerating their profitability and, operating income, and their valuation is obviously sky high. So every individual investor needs clear expectations on what their growth outlook versus their multiple is. So in terms of how Palantir fits with my own personal criteria, are they aligned with secular trends? Of course, right? AI adoption, data and analytics, defense modernization are all very strong trends. In terms of market advantages, operational AI, ontology, the fact that they're experienced with mission-critical systems are all huge market advantages. In terms of increasing cash flows, the answer is definitely yes, and efficient capital allocation is definitely yes, with their ROIC just under 40%. So in terms of my overall thoughts for Palantir, first off, I just wanted to apologize to all you guys out there who have been telling me to dig into Palantir, have been commenting about Palantir, have been telling me that I should have included Palantir. You know what? Honestly, you were right. Palantir is one of the most interesting companies that I've dug into recently because nobody's really doing what they're doing. And they're one of the more innovative companies in terms of how they hire and how they operate. And that really bodes well for them going forward. So yeah, I really kind of fell in love with Palantir doing this research. But the question that I have to ask myself is, do I really want to buy a company that's trading at 200 price to cash flow? Well, the answer is no, not really. I would prefer not to do that. But I do know this, I will be buying Palantir at some point. I don't know when, I don't know what price, but I can 100% guarantee that it will end up in my portfolio at some point in time. And it might be one of those things where I just kind of take a look at the charts a little bit, look at it from a technical perspective to see if there's an entry point that I can kind of live with just based on what the charts are telling me. So what do you guys think about Palantir? I know you have a strong opinion either one way or another, so let me know down in the comments. Now, if you want more details on how Snowflake is different, I did a whole analysis on them a while back, and you can watch that by clicking this video right here. Hope you guys have a great day out there. Financial independence is true freedom, so keep building and stacking wins, and I'll see you on the next one. Peace.